Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. What is mental fitness? Too often we hear that we have to have a problem or a diagnosis before we start taking an active interest in our mental health. How do we shift that mindset? Today we're talking about resiliency. What does it mean? What are the key components of resiliency? We're going to be talking about why it's important to us and can it be taught? My guest today is Hadleigh Fischer. I first came across Hadleigh when I bought a present for a member of my family, and that present was the Resilience Agenda. Resilience Agenda is actually Hadleigh's product. He runs a company, he runs his own podcast, and so much of what we're speaking about today and the message that Hadleigh spreads is around your mental fitness toolkit, many aspects of which are covered within the Resilience Agenda. So the premise behind our conversation today is that I want you to imagine a world where people are inspired to think of their mental fitness just like their physical fitness. We're going to cover many aspects of the 5 pillars of well-being and the mental fitness framework today, from movement, nutrition, sleep, connection, mindset, and then words like optimism, mindfulness, gratitude, as I'm a big fan of, reframing, perspective. All of these things, Hadleigh just has such a wonderful way of articulating them. As I've already alluded to as well, Hadleigh does run his own podcast. We will stick a link for that in the notes as well. More importantly than that, the Resilience Agenda. So I bought this solely for a member of my family, and I actually got a second one for myself. It only costs like 20 quid. This is not a sponsorship. Hadleigh did not pay me or this to promote the book or the thing. I just came across it, found it so incredibly useful. The person whom I bought it for, she has found it very useful as well. And I just love it. And I'd love to be able to share that with you and for you guys and girls to go and have a look at that. So we will stick a link in the notes for that as well. It's a great little A5 agenda calendar as well for 2024. It's got a load of mental fitness strategies, reminders, self-development tools in it, and a lot of stuff that we're going to be speaking about today as well. There's aspects of post-traumatic growth in there, how we expose ourselves to stress, how we think about and expose ourselves and allow ourselves to entertain those limiting thoughts. There's things about how we control the things that influence us, the things we have influence over, and our sort of sphere of control. Going to form parts of our conversations today as well. So I want you to go and check it out as a tip, as a gift from me. Go and have a look at it. Super, super useful for yourself or for someone else. We're still in January now. It's a great time to get it. And hopefully, in fact, maybe today we will get so many insights from today's conversation. So take this as your inside, behind the curtain look and listen with all of the layers of authenticity that Hadleigh brings to this. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope you get a glance and go and get your own. I ordered one for my partner. Hers is purple. I went for the pink one, naturally. Although I think they call it dusty blush or something like that. It's a different colour. Take a look. If you want to get some new habits, if you want to shift your mindset, if you want to focus more on your mental fitness and well-being, go and check it out. Thanks for coming back to the podcast. And without further ado, please welcome Hadleigh Fischer. What does resiliency mean?
Resiliency is the ability to bounce back or to bounce forward from adversity, setbacks, uncertainty, or change. And so the typical definition of resilience, according to traditional science, is the ability to bounce back from setbacks. You are a certain way, something happens, you might lose a partner, you might have a major trauma, you might have a car accident, you might lose your keys, whatever it is. And then you deal with that situation well, and then you bounce back to the way you were before. And that's the general definition of resilience. But more recent thinking about it is that when something, especially something traumatic or major, happens in your life, there's no going back. And so rather than bouncing back, the new thinking around resilience is around bouncing forward. So for example, the most horrible thing you could probably think of is your child passing away. Hopefully that isn't appropriate to anyone listening to this. But let's say that's the example we're using. There's no going back to who you were before that happens. It's going to change you one way or another. And so the bouncing forward idea is around, I'm going somewhere different, I didn't expect to be here. I didn't want to be here. But somehow I need to keep going. Somehow this needs to become not something I like, but it needs to become okay somehow. And that's the new definition of resilience.
Makes me think of post-traumatic growth was also another phrase that kind of got bounced around with regard of that as well. And it also makes me think of, when they say the same man never enters a river twice, because the river's changed and so has the man. You never go into these situations the same again. My wife and I, took me a second then, because when you said that, we miscarried twins a number of years ago. And I've spoken to a lot of parents that have lost children in driving incidents. So we've gone to road traffic collisions, distraction, drugs perhaps, alcohol, speeding, many other factors. And you hear some of the interviews, and I've sat in the rooms of some of these individuals which have felt capable to come in and speak to other people going on to their journey of driving. And they say, "Oh, time heals all wounds." And one of these women said, "You know what? I don't think it does. I don't buy into that." She said, "I think you just change. You never go back." And that's what was screaming to me when you were saying it was like things will go back to how they were. No, things will never go back. Everything is always moving forwards. Everything is always changing.
Yeah.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together.
Absolutely. And it builds on that concept you mentioned of post-traumatic growth. That's a concept by a researcher by the name of Richard Tedeschi. He's the expert in that field. And this is part of the key to that concept. It is that what happens when, say, you lose a child in a car accident or some other major adversity is your whole worldview is shattered. The sense of the world being fair, good things happen to good people, things turn out for the best. If I put in if I work hard, this and this will happen. And what he says is that roughly 50% of people, and it's more than you'd expect, but roughly 50% of people after a major trauma experience post-traumatic growth. Only a minority experience the more famous post-traumatic stress disorder. And he says what characterizes, and this is a big part of mental fitness, it's a big part of resilience, but what characterizes post-traumatic growth is people's worldview, their sense of meaning is destroyed. But they go to a new place, they're able to find new meaning. And that can take a long time for some people. Some people get there quicker. But they typically come to learn that going back to where they were, that old worldview, doesn't make sense anymore. So to go back there is just going to invite further pain and trauma. It's that I can't accept that my life has changed. That's one of the core issues there. Whereas, okay, I lost my child. Yes, I now have to deal with physical disabilities. Yes, my partner left me. Yes, I lost that career that I loved. I'm going to go to this new place. It's not where I would prefer to be. I wouldn't have chosen to be here, but somehow I'm going to make it okay. And then you rebuild the meaning in your life. And so the classic example is the cancer survivor who gets cancer, goes through their treatment, hopefully does okay in their treatment, and then goes out and supports other people through the early phases of their journey. And so one of the things that Tedeschi talks about is go and find your tribe, whatever has hurt you or whatever you're experiencing, go and find other people who are just experiencing that now and go out and support them in some way. And it's a new way to create meaning. Another thing that happens when people experience a major trauma is they simplify their lives. The things that matter to them, they're not as worried about their career as much or how much money they've got. They tend to focus more on family, personal growth, connections, the things that science tells us make us happy anyway, but often people need to go through that adversity to realize that. And so there's some of the steps that you can go through. And one of the things that I find really valuable, it's not going to make it any easier to go through a major trauma like this, but just knowing that a major trauma doesn't inevitably have to lead to depression and anxiety and PTSD is a small step. It's possible. It doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean it will always happen, but it's possible for things to change and be okay. And that is, to answer your first question, that's at the core of resilience, and in particular, mental fitness.
There's so many things in my head going through there when you speak. So one thing is, it made me think of like the if-then rule, because your worldview is based on a series of if-then. Like, if my child dies, my life is over. Not necessarily. And that is such a horrible, offensive thing to say to someone, almost, to someone that does have their child and couldn't bear the thought of losing them. But equally, if I am raped, then I will kill myself. If then. And like you've just said, I remember a great phrase that adversity introduces a man to himself, because it's a bit like there's only a few foundational aspects to this room, and if we set fire to the whole room, a lot of it would just burn away, and the foundational aspects that I truly need to survive and that truly make me happy are the ones that would remain. And the rest of it was just bullshit that I was just filling my life with. And that aspect of simplification, that reminds me of things like essentialism and minimalist thinking and things like that, which are really helpful concepts to introduce yourself to. But they say the devil looks for white space in the diary, and equally, if you don't face any tremendous adversities, it can be very easy to fill your life with these things that seem essential to you, but incredibly difficult. And it's also the sort of thing you never wish to place upon somebody else. I know we do a lot of work with women in the fire service, and one of their favorite phrases is, you have to see it to be it. And they speak about that in the context of female leaders within organizations. But it made me think of exactly that when you said finding your tribe, because seeing someone on the other side of where you are, like I was a drug addict for 5 years, and part of the 12th step is paying it forward effectively. The 12th step is finding someone that you can mentor, coach, sponsor through that process, because you think you're looking into a cave. This isn't a tunnel that there's a light at the end of. It's a cave. There is no end to this, and you do have to see it to be it. You have to see someone say, I lost my child 10 years ago. And it really hurts. And every single day it hurts. But I'm still here.
Absolutely. And, one of the things about resilience is you can learn and build resilience after or immediately after a traumatic event. And some people sort of do that kind of like without a map or a compass. And some people are, even though resilience can be learned, some people are just naturally more resilient than others. Their environment, their gene makeup, the way they think, it prepares them better, for these setbacks.
Genetic? Can it be genetic, your resiliency?
The things that contribute to resilience are influenced by your genes, but the science is pretty clear that resilience can be learnt, and it is a skill, and it's a skill that can be learnt like any other, which is really empowering. But the time to learn that skill is not in the depths of trauma. Now, you might have to sort of sink or swim, so to speak, if something happens to you and you're not necessarily prepared for it. And the reason why we love the term mental fitness as the how-to for building resilience, resilient is what you want to be, mental fitness is the how-to for getting there, is that let's say you had to run into a burning building. Well, is that easier done if you're 300 pounds and haven't been jogging recently, or if you're physically fit? Is it easier to go for a marathon if you don't work out, or if you do a bit of training? Is it easier to hike up a mountain, which, mountain is a metaphor for life? Is it easier to hike up a mountain if you train or if you don't? It's pretty obvious. And we understand this for our physical fitness. But when it comes to our mental fitness, most of us don't really think about it that much, because the only time you would ever work on your mental health or your mental fitness is if there's something wrong. And so just like the best time to work on your physical fitness or to train for a marathon is not when you've just had a heart attack, it's when you're feeling pretty good. So for the last 50 years, we've been saying to people, if you have a heart attack, come and see us, we'll be able to help you out. We'll put a new heart in, we'll fix a few things up, we'll send you back out there. That's been the approach. And then a while back, things changed. They said, actually, the way you sleep, the way you eat, the way you exercise, we can prevent heart attacks. And people many people take that approach to their physical fitness now. But it's not how we think about our mental health. The first time most people think about their mental health is when they experience a major trauma, or when they go through a burnout, or everything just gets blue for them, and it's a major it's a major hole, or someone they know or love experiences that. And just like the heart attack to marathon example, major depression to thriving is not an easy transition. And so that's why we say...
But it's almost like we only realise it when we start to dip underneath the water, isn't it? Because when you mentioned that term first to me before we started recording today, that aspect of mental fitness, when you say mental health, if we played word association game, that for most people in society, I would guess, would bring negative connotations. If you said, I'm focusing on my mental health, Pete, then maybe I would think, are you depressed? Are you developing sociopathic, psychopathic tendencies? Are you struggling with your mood? Are you an addict? What is this you're struggling with? I would have a lot of negative connotations. But you're right. We don't seem to have the same conceptual approach as we do with our physical. Even though I always say, and a lot of people will agree, you can't separate the mind from the body. One everywhere you go, there it is. But this aspect of talking about and creating open spaces and creating, I suppose, the vernacular and the language for mental fitness will be a very new concept to a lot of people.
Exactly. So a couple of things you just raised. Mental health and mental illness are both very stigmatized terms. Stigma is basically an old Greek term, which means branded, and it kind of means, we kind of associate it with negative connotations. Mental health and mental illness are not the same thing. Now, you hear people use the term, I have mental health, meaning they have mental illness. But that's not a correct use of language. You have mental health, Pete. I have mental health. We all have mental health. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good, sometimes it's in the middle. And it goes up and down, it fluctuates. If you have poor mental health, you're likely to have a mental illness. So it's like this spectrum, left to right, 0 to 10. And if you're, let's say, a score, you might score yourself, or you might be scored by a doctor, for example. Let's say you're between 0 and 3 or 4. You're likely to have a mental illness. You have poor mental health. And then if you might score 7 or 8 or 9, you might say you have good mental health. And then if you're in the middle, you might say you have moderate mental health. And that's the first thing that I like to clear up with people, that just because you talk about mental health or you have mental health doesn't mean you have a problem with it. Okay, so if we say that what good mental health is, the actual definition of mental health doesn't say anything about anxiety, suicide, or depression. The definition of mental health is the ability to contribute to community, achieve things in line with your values, maintain social relationships, reach your potential. And the difference between that a psychologist or a psychiatrist would use to define a mental illness is basically a loss of functioning. and functioning according to those categories. Does your illness or what you're experiencing get in the way of social relationships? Does it get in the way of concentrating at work? Does it get in the way of planning self-care and looking after yourself? Does it get in the way of dealing with problems and setbacks? And so that is, this continuum. And then the way to build mental health is to become resilient. So, Donald Robinson, an author and a psychologist, talks about resilience being the holy grail of mental health. And we like to say that mental fitness is
it a branding problem as well, though?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why we love the term mental fitness, because what are the connotations and associations that most people have with fitness? That it can be improved, that it's intrinsically useful, that it's good for its own sake. It also will help you prevent anxiety and depression, but it will also help you feel better, be happier, have better relationships, have more satisfying relationships, achieve more, set more goals, recover from stress better. And so I'm sure we're going to talk about this in a moment, what actually is mental fitness and what goes into it. But that's the language that is starting to appear. And we're just at this point at the moment where it's important to say that whilst pursuing mental fitness and increasing your levels of resilience and increasing your mental health resources, because that's what resilience is, it's your psychological resources for when things go awry in your life.
In other news, this episode is brought to you in partnership with MSA Safety. Today we have them to thank for the improved firefighter safety through connectivity in their brand new connected firefighter system. At the center of the connected firefighter platform is the MSA M1 SCBA with telemetry. You can view battery life, air pressure, and estimated time remaining either independently on the M1 itself or from the Luna connected device screen. Also, still with the air status, alarm information, search status, and all of this provided to the incident command for confident decision making during the scene. That integrates straight in with the Luna system, which is a wireless all-in-one device creating an independent search and rescue network, providing edge detection, enhanced personal thermal imaging, while simplifying post-scene reporting and data retention. One of the key parts of the Luna is their FAST system, the Firefighting Assisting Search Technology. This combines directional and distance information with thermal imaging to help find separated teammates and decrease response time. It actually connects you to the other crews in the vicinity for a unified search during the time of mutual aid by instantly notifying the network of Luna devices when there is a downed crew member, allowing for a prompt search and rescue. All of this then plugs into the FireGrid system for cloud-based connectivity, real-time information, and data-driven decisions for the incident commander. It enables you to see the exact location of your firefighters on the scene. And it doesn't require you to be sat on the station. The MSA Hub then provides a wireless gateway straight to the cloud, enabling wireless on-scene data for local and remote incident command for additional eyes on the scene. MSA are truly taking massive strides in the future of improved firefighter safety through connectivity. MSA is dedicated to increasing safety in the fire service through technological advancements. Various feature enhancements, new products, partnerships, and integrations will provide additional capabilities readily accessible by products, software, and services in the brand new MSA Connected Firefighter platform. Now back to the show. Just to build on that, so the branding side of it for me is, I think we've accidentally done a lot of damage here in many ways. So there's a few things for me to unpick or to ask you to just double click on for me. So the fact that we have made it very clinical. So when we talk about mental health and psychological state of mind and things like that, it moved from maybe a religious context, because the things you were saying there as well, I'm not remotely religious, but I always say religious is like a placebo, and I say that with respect. If you go to a place or you engage in a community that makes you feel better, makes you act more in line with your values, then it works, and no one can say that it doesn't. But as we've seen the death of religion in a lot of places across the world for many reasons we probably haven't got time to get into today, but we've seen the growth of science and evidence-backed knowledge and clinical and all that aspect of it. And that's where mental health, mental fitness, mental well-being, mental ill health that's basically the bucket it's fallen into. If you have a problem with some of these things, there wasn't a religious answer, or we don't encourage people to seek a religious answer as much now. We look at it as more of a clinical side of it. But then just to build on that and to ask you around the branding for resiliency, if resiliency is one of the strategic pathways towards mental fitness, I think we've done a lot of damage to resiliency through individuals who I love, but that's because of the person that I am, and I am a stereotype. I'm a walking stereotype in itself. People like David Goggins and resiliency, and people in the UK. The gentleman's name, Ross Edgley, wrote a book called Resiliency, where he swam around the UK, and it gets closely associated with doing some heroic physical feat, the stoicism aspect, pushing a boulder up a mountain, being able to sit in an ice bath for 5 minutes, and that actually makes it quite elitist, and I think acts as barriers to something that would bring a lot of fulfillment and a lot of improved life circumstances for people who don't wish to run an ultra marathon, but would actually benefit tremendously from engaging in a greater focus on their resiliency and mental fitness.
I agree, and there's two things I'd love to unpack from what you've just said. That the term resilience, as you've just used it then, is often used in place of a term or a term like mental toughness. And you can imagine that in your field,
grit,
maybe 10,
grit was another
maybe
one.
10, 20 years ago, the term mental fitness, the term mental toughness, 10, 20 years ago in the firefighting world and the emergency services would be seen as a value. But the way we're going, I'd be interested to see how this is in the UK, but certainly in Australia, from my limited experience with dealing with emergency services, it's getting people in touch with their emotions and getting, to use that term, vulnerable. Toughness is not really what we're after anymore, because you might have heard of Nicholas Taleb and his book, The Black Swan. Okay, the wonderful concept called the Black Swan, which is this thing that comes out of nowhere that you didn't predict, that was obvious in hindsight, or maybe it wasn't obvious, like losing your child, like your house burning down, and it changes everything. And he says some things are robust. Some things that, probably a better way to explain it is some things are fragile. Exposed to stress and exposed to agile, they break. They're fragile. Then you've got, hopefully, an improvement on that, which is something that's robust. When exposed to stress, it doesn't break. It's resilient. But then he has this concept called anti-fragile. The opposite of fragile isn't robust. It's actually something that gets better with stress and shock and trauma. And if you're listening to this, that can sound like a heavy thing to hear, but it is possible. Just like what we were talking about with post-traumatic growth before, that things can get better. And when you go to the gym, for example, you are setting yourself a deliberate, controlled level of stress. You're stressing your body. That's exactly what you do. And then you recover and you go back and do it again. The problem with life is that we can't always control the level of stress that hits us. And so that's the first challenge with the word resilience. The second one, and I was actually doing some research for my company. I named my company 8 years ago Resilience Agenda, because the term resilience appealed to me. And in that time, the term resilience has taken on a bit of a negative meaning. And I've actually been wondering, should I rebrand the company? I was on a Reddit feed the other day, just looking up the term resilience. And there were a whole lot of people on there who made some really valid points that they keep getting told by HR at work, hey, just be more resilient. And we can not have to worry about changing that toxic culture that's really causing the problems. So it's your fault for being a bad, unresilient employee, not ours for not creating the right work environment for you. And I was doing a training session with a big company in Switzerland recently. It was a resilience training session, and that was a common refrain from the participants in the audience. There's nothing in our control. There's nothing we can do because the organisation, is so toxic, And the more that they tell us to be resilient, the more we resist. And then the third thing is we do a lot of work on social media.
Yes.
Resiliency is becoming, for some people, a prerogative of privilege, as you say, or elitist. But one of the key messages that you sort of need to explore...
I think some people see it as toxic masculinity as well.
Yeah, that's true.
I think for some people, resiliency, if I say become more resilient, it's interchangeable with man up. And that is seen as toxic masculinity. And
absolutely.
The two are not the same at all.
They're not the same. And so manning up or, getting over it or whatever, those terms that we use that you shouldn't say to people, that might be the end result. But there's a process or a how in between that will get you there. And so I think it's really important that, hopefully we talk about this in a moment, but in these comments we're hearing that I was reading and Reddit comments and what have you, and I know in the UK at the moment there's a lot of people struggling with cost of living pressures, for example. People say, because I'm marginalised, because I'm a person of colour, because I'm a part of a minority community, because I'm financially disadvantaged, resilience means nothing to me, because that's the privilege of white HR people or people with time or whatever it might be. And to an extent, they're right. But part of resilience, and one of the core concepts of resilience and of mental fitness, is that it's not what happens to you that determines your well-being or your level of mental health or your happiness. It's how you respond to that. And if you say that to someone in a crisis or who's going through a trauma, naturally it comes across as insensitive. And the time to learn that insight, that skill, hopefully is when things are okay. That's why the fitness metaphor is so valuable, because the best time to get out of a ditch is not when it's getting deeper and deeper. It's when you're okay, when you can reach out. And that's why we want to inspire people with this term mental fitness when they're more or less okay, or going through an okay time, or they're on the pathway to recovery out of something difficult. That's when you need to care about mental fitness. And you have those psychological resources, those skills, those tools, those options at hand for when something goes wrong and you think, okay, this has happened, what do I turn to? Is it a psychological skill? Is it a resilience or mental fitness skill? Or is it something destructive that is a very common method that people go down? And so that takes time to learn. And you can't just say to people, I'll just learn that, in an afternoon at work, or just man up. You've actually got to go through the things that contribute to resilience. There's resilience is where we want to be. Mental fitness is the how. And then you've got to know and do those things over time, consistently, and have them at hand so that you've got those options when life gets tough.
There's a wonderful toolkit that you guys and girls have, and we'll reference for people who want to go and have a look. So you can go into the notes and you will see a link to the resiliency agenda. But I want us to just start to look and unpack a few of these if we could. Again, we'll attempt the impossible because these are... And actually, people can go over to your podcast, and there is independent episodes on each of these. You've spoke to some wonderful subject matter experts on each of these. But I'd love to paddle in the pool of each of these to see if we can just start to draw a brief map for people to look at some of the things in this toolkit, because there's aspects of more a framework or more of a toolkit, and I know there's 5 pillars of wellbeing which I'm really interested in going into. If you could start to walk us through a few of those.
Sure. So there are about 85 things in the science that are good for your mental health and well-being and happiness. And, it's a lot to incorporate. And so what we did was we came up with a concept called the Mental Fitness Toolkit, which narrows them down to 10, in consultation with, different experts and what have you. I want to start first with a definition of what mental fitness is. Mental fitness is the mindset, process, and strategies for protecting and improving your mental health. The mindset is this idea that your mental health can be improved. That it is a learnable skill, that over time it can get better. That's a really important insight that a lot of people don't have. They just think, this happened to me, therefore it's inevitable that I'm going to feel this way. Or I was born this way, therefore that's inevitable. And we're learning more and more about how that's not true. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy, and it's not equally easy for everyone, but things can get better. You are a good example of that. You've gone from drug addiction to now inspiring others. That's an example. Things can get better. That's the mindset. The process is everything that you think about when it comes to physical fitness. The language of goal setting, of measuring, of making time, doing it with others. It can be fun, it can be outdoors, it can be active. All those metaphors and ideas around fitness might take a bit of effort initially. You build habits out of it. There's dozens of ways that process makes sense to a lot of people. Some people have good experiences with physical fitness. Other people have never had good experiences losing weight or being able to exercise or whatever it might be. And that can go two ways. For some people, that process or that metaphor of physical fitness doesn't work for them. But the other way to look at that is, well, hang on, there's a whole other half to my health, which is this mind health thing that I can actually re-engage with. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. And then the strategies are what we call the mental fitness toolkit. And so we divide the toolkit into two different sections. There's the pillars or the foundations of your well-being, and then there are the skills of mental fitness. So let's just run through them all at a higher level, and then we'll go into them in a little bit more detail and we can unpack them. So the toolkit is 10 tools that you practice, understand and apply as you can. They are movement, nutrition, sleep, connection, and mindset. And then the skills are optimism, mindfulness, gratitude, reframing, and perspective. So let's just go through them one by one. Those pillars, they will affect your life whether you want them to or not. The way you'll either eat well or you won't. You'll move well or you won't. You'll sleep well or you won't. You'll either have good relationships or you won't, or you'll think well or you won't. You can't help it. You've got to deal with it somehow. And each of those things are really, really important as a baseline for our resilience, our endurance, our ability to handle life, the ability to have enough energy. The thing that most people understand is that if you don't sleep enough, you'll feel tired physically, or that if you don't move, you might put on weight, or that if you don't have friends, you'll be lonely, or whatever it might be. But each of those pillars don't just influence your physical health, they also influence your mental health specifically. Studies have shown that movement is just as effective as antidepressants for mild to moderate depression. Now, it doesn't mean that movement or exercise is easy for people who are really struggling. That's just what the science shows. And we call it movement and not exercise because for a lot of people, the idea of exercise, these big hour-long chunks of sweaty effort, are either something they can't find time for or they're just not motivated to do. So we call it movement, which means get up from your desk every half an hour or so. Find ways to move. Dance with your kids. It's almost as good as a proper gym session. So the regularity of it. And exercise isn't just something that helps you lose weight. It actually helps you feel good. What happens when you move and exercise, and we don't have to tell firefighters this, but some people probably do need to hear this, is that when we're stressed and distracted, we have these chemicals that go through our body that put us into this fight or flight state. Cortisol is released. And if we don't sort of recover from a stressful situation, they just stay in our body. It takes away our ability to focus, it breaks down tissue. But what exercise does is it encourages your body to make other chemicals that turn off the cortisol. The body sees the spike, kind of like when you're running away from a tiger or running into a burning house. You get it done, and then it ends. And your body sort of comes back, I'm sure you can describe a lot better than me, that state of coming down from a high adrenaline situation. Well, it's important to get yourself into that more regularly than not. But even just day to day, getting up and down, going for a little walk outside has similar effects. So that's movement. And then you've got
I always say
nutrition.
that your body is a walking, talking drug factory, and you're the drug dealer. You've got to make the right exchanges to dump all of these drugs, all that endorphin, dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, cortisol. You have all of these drugs in your pockets. You can dispense them into your body, and you'll get a different result if you choose to do that. But you have to elicit the right behaviors, or put yourself in the right environments, or put yourself around the right people to allow these drugs to, and it might be not a good analogy for some people, but these are all natural drugs. Your body will secrete them naturally. You just need to press the right buttons.
Absolutely. And I think people often need to get past two limiting thoughts when it comes to exercise and movement. One is that exercise makes you tired. That's the first one. Maybe if you haven't moved for a while, the first 2 weeks are going to be particularly difficult, but over time, movement and exercise give you more energy, not less. It may not feel that way in the first week or two, but that's what happens over time. And the other one is that, if I can't reach my ideal self of the hour-long gym workout, then there's no point doing anything at all. But, in COVID, for example, one of the favourite tips we used to share with people who were stuck at home working behind their desks was the fake commute. Walk to the tram and back, or walk to the shop and back. Get out of the house morning and evening, and it just puts you in a different frame of mind. You forget a few things, you get a few nice little distractions, rather than being in that same environment that you talked about. And so,
that's great.
There's lots of things we could talk about when it comes to movement, but I might move on to the next one, which is nutrition.
Please.
And the key thing there is that most people think about nutrition in terms of how they look. Think about it in terms of how you feel. And for people who just can't lose weight, well, the way you feel can almost change instantly. There's a researcher in Australia, Dr. Felice Jacka, who has a study called the SMILES study. And basically, what you eat and how you eat it impacts your mood and how you feel within hours. And that's the first thing, that you can feel better and have better mental health and have no effect on your waistline, and that's a real win. It's a huge win for people. So, the way you eat impacts your mental health. The second thing that people often get wrong, and nutrition's my weakness, is they focus on what they're not eating or what they're eliminating or avoiding, not so much the good things that go in. And Felice had a couple of really wonderful tips that she shared with me once that I keep thinking about. One is, she says, try and crowd out your plate with the good stuff before the junk stuff. So there's a behavioural thing, for example. Let's say you want to eat more veggies and less, pasta or whatever, or sweets or whatever it might be. Put those things on your plate first. See if you can fill up as much of the plate as you want. And then when you put the meat on, or whatever it is that you're trying to eat less of, it literally won't fit on the plate. It's just a little behavioural trick. Rather than putting the meat on first and fitting the veggies around it, do it the other way around. And it's just a little tweaks like that are really valuable. And then she has this thing like, how many things have you eaten out of the ground today? Try and go for 20. So my wife and I are constantly counting, okay, we ate this and this and this, and hang on, we haven't had a meal. We're only eating 10 things out of the ground today. Let's make a salad or a vegetable bowl or something for dinner. We don't do it every night, but it's just a cool thing to think about. And I've had this experience on my website. Nutrition is so controversial. There is no more confusing area of science, and public nutrition, public health knowledge is it's almost incomprehensible. And I try and sort of stay above it by just saying these obvious things that people can really find valuable, because it all depends on whether you're allergic to gluten or dairy, or whether you're a vegan or a vegetarian, or everyone's got their preference. And everyone who has a barrier to push online about nutrition is really religious and ideological about their position. I'm keto only, no sugar this. And, in truth, it's probably a bit of a balance between everything and whatever your situation is. But there are a few principles that science has shown work for mental health. And that is pretty much the Mediterranean diet. Eat lots of green leafy things. eat good fats that go into the proteins that make up your body and in particular your brain. Try and avoid fatty and processed foods as best you can. And they're the basic things. There's a lot more detail in there, but I wouldn't want to get any more prescriptive because people will get upset with me. But they're the basics that you can hardly disagree with. Eat more healthy fats, eat more greens, crowd out the bad stuff. There's a few basics there. And then sleep. Sleep is a hard one. It's hard for firefighters working throughout the night. It's hard for young parents. That's something that we're probably going to have to deal with as a couple over the next year or two. But, lack of sleep is an epidemic. And
but also, with the greatest of respect, even when people have time off and it's within your sphere of control, our sleep hygiene as a society has gotten really, really poor.
Absolutely. And there's a number of social and societal explainers for that. Electric light, not something we want to get rid of, but we keep the daylight going into the darkest hours of the night. We don't separate work and life as well as we used to. I'm very guilty of that in my own life, but at least I have some boundaries in place. The biggest one for me personally is stimulants. Caffeine. I don't drink caffeine after midday. A lot of people don't know this, but caffeine has a half-life of about 6 to 7 hours, which means half of it is still in your body 6 to 7 hours later, and then half of that amount is still there 6 or 7 hours later. So just doing a little thought experiment, if you have a coffee at midday, a quarter of that coffee or caffeine is still in your body at 2 a.m. and you're trying to get to sleep. Now, I'm not saying give up coffee.
Blocking all of your adenosine receptors and stopping you falling into that deep sleep.
Yeah, so it stops you getting into deep sleep. And on that point, alcohol is another big one. And a lot of people think, I'm going to have a great night's sleep if I have a glass or two of wine. Alcohol might help you get to sleep, but it actually reduces significantly the quality of your sleep. And you don't get into that deep sleep mode, you don't process things as well, you wake up feeling groggy. And so, stimulants and, coffee and alcohol are the two big ones there. And then, sleep hygiene. I don't love the term sleep hygiene because it sounds so, medical and like you're going to the dentist, which is not exactly an inspiring thing for a lot of people. But, a lot of you guys would already know this, but for the non-firefighters who are listening, it's things like sleep in the coldest environment you can stand, sleep in the darkest of environment you can think about. And then, I'm sure we're going to get to this a bit later in the conversation, try not to be overstimulated by digital devices too close to bedtime. We'll get to that one. So that's sleep in a nutshell. But I want to move on to connection briefly, which is the fourth one. And the number one predictor, and then there's daylight between that and the next one, number one predictor of well-being, happiness, productivity at work, is social connection. If you could sum up in one tip or one skill or one concept how to improve resilience, it's social support. So when someone goes through a traumatic incident, they need people around them. Not so much to talk them through it, but just to be there and say, I'm there. And if you want to talk through it, I'm here. If you don't, that's fine too, but I'm around. Connection is something that, for different reasons, we're finding harder in the world these days. COVID was a huge public experiment on taking people away from the very things that support well-being. In Melbourne, where I'm from originally, we made it so you couldn't go more than 5 kilometres from your house. So taking away movement. Wow. Connection, the number one predictor of well-being during difficult times. You couldn't see people unless they were in your close family, and that's what happened around a lot of the world. And we're still living with those consequences. And it's very easy to
I think it's been perpetuated as well because we've never been more connected than we are now, yet for many people they've never felt so alone because digital connection is a bit of a trick. It's not by any means the same level. We're missing so much of again, all the chemicals and the feelings and we're pack animals. We need that connection on a very regular basis.
Absolutely. And just on that point, I mean, people often wonder why that is. If you think about, the savannah 10,000 years ago, you needed your tribe. You needed to belong to a group or a tribe, or else you would literally die. You wouldn't survive. And so that has both practical aspects, but also social aspects that you need to sort of fit into the group. You need to feel like you belong. And so fast forward to the present day, people are living more and more individual lives. Our schedules, especially since COVID and people who are working from home, what might work for you individually around flexibility may not work for you as a community or a society. And what used to happen was we had these default institutions in our lives. Even if you weren't that religious, you went to church on a Sunday, you volunteered at the football club on a Thursday night, and you had this. You used to go into the office or the firehouse, and even if you didn't like the people you work with, it sort of had this benefit. It just rubbed off on you. Most people need that. Well, think about the way many of us live now and since COVID. Your default institutions, your community institutions, are not there. People don't go to church as much. People are not involved in volunteering or sports clubs as much. We're working from home more. We're working in a more isolated way, especially when you've got kids. Coordinating your schedule with another person is really, really difficult. Who's tried to organise a dinner and you're having to go back and forward, 5 or 6 times in order to find someone's schedule? It's even tougher. It's even tougher when they've got kids. So you see people every 3 months, and so what are the key points here? You've got to recognise the importance of connection to both productivity, well-being, happiness, and your ability to function during tough times. What we're really big on at Resilience Agenda is scheduling it. If it doesn't just happen organically, if you don't live with the people you need to connect with, or if you don't just stumble upon them in the street, like many people don't, you've got to find ways to make that happen. We might be able to talk about some of those ways. And ultimately, when we look back on our lives, the things that actually make them worthwhile are time spent with friends and loved ones. So connection is different to relationships. Anyone can have a relationship, but a connection is a relationship built on trust, mutual understanding, common experience, and meaningful conversations. And you talked about digital connections and how they're not quite the same. Well, often the same level of meaning isn't there. And so for first responders, military, firefighters, they do meaningful things together every day, and they develop these bonds. They develop this connection. You go for a hike with someone, you did something difficult together. We often hear these stories about people who come back from war. They're closely bonded. They've done something meaningful and difficult together. You might start a business together. It's an interesting question to ask yourself. What am I doing that's meaningful with other people? And it may not be an actual activity, but they're the things that we often think about as the highs of our life when we look back on them. There's a lovely book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. Number 1 regret was I wish I spent more time with the people I love. It's a wonderful book. I wish I spent more time with the people I love. I wished I was more true to myself. I wish I told the people that I spent time with what I really thought, and was more open and honest. And my colleague Paula Robinson has this concept called the team, and she's like, well, we often hear that connection's good. And it's a really valuable thing to build, but I actually don't know how to do it because I live alone, or I have a mental illness, or I'm socially awkward, or I have social anxiety. And she has this wonderful model of, okay, where do we start thinking about this? Who is on my team, and whose team am I on? That's the first thing she gets you to consider. Who relies on you? And who do you rely on? And it's a wonderful exercise to have a think about. And then
it's a good reframe.
when you're trying to think about your team, She says, who do you need to recruit? Do you need to recruit new players? Do you need to go out and make new friends? That might be the case if you're moving to a new city or if you've changed jobs. Then the second question is,
sometimes
do I need
you
to
just
put
want to
anyone on the
change
bench?
behaviours. People listening to some of the stuff you're talking about now are the right people on the bus for the place you think you want to go. That's sometimes one of the most difficult parts of the people you've surrounded yourself with.
Well, there's three categories there. There's the new people that you might need to find, and that's often that's a difficult thing. Takes a lot of time. It's hard to do with kids or busy work. There's who do you need to put on the bench? So who are you not connected with? Who is actually causing you, trauma or conflict or strife, or who is de-energizing you? That's not always easy to do, but it's important to divide into those categories. And then who do you deepen connections with? And the most reliable and practical thing for most people is to deepen the connections with who is already on the bus with you. And there are different ways of doing that. We can go into that if you like. But trying to make your conversations more meaningful is one of the most effective ways of doing that.
Today's podcast is powered by our partner Lifelines and their revolutionary approach to functional hydration. Just like in firefighting, water is essential for body function, but studies show more than 80% of firefighters are dehydrated. A 25-year study findings from the National Institute of Health showed poor hydration to be linked to early aging and chronic disease, and even mild dehydration results in significant negative impact outcomes including headaches, exhaustion, rapid pulse, irritability, and poor cognitive function. A study conducted by Yale University showed that participants who were just 1% dehydrated had a 12% increase in errors when performing tasks that required cognitive flexibility. In addition, dehydration is shown to worsen mood and attitude, contribute to confusion and poor decision making, and negatively affect memory and judgment. In other words, you really don't want your incident commander, firefighter, or for that matter any first responder on a critical scene to be even slightly dehydrated. Mild dehydration occurs when a person is just 1.5% dehydrated, a condition that does not even trigger the thirst response in most people. So just imagine how quickly a firefighter or any first responder can and does become dehydrated in their day-to-day duties, which is why I address my hydration first thing every day with Lifelines. Go into the notes for this episode and specifically check out Lifeline's Hydro Fuel and Hydro OG by clicking in the notes for the podcast for a clean energy solution designed for those who demand more from their day. Now back to the show. Mindset is one aspect that has been given a lot of bandwidth. It's been given a lot of interpretation, and again, when we talk about a branding perspective, this is something that I think might be one of the hardest ones for people to connect with, because I think there's been a little bit of damage done there. People hear mindset, they hear woo-woo, they think meditation, some other word association, but it's been one of the creating mental space for me to even think about something. When I want to make progress in my life, when I want to develop the podcast, when I want to do whatever, I need to create mental space and get myself in a position where I can play in the sandpit mentally. And mindset is like the weather. It's an ongoing challenge for me personally.
Well, that's the thing about mental fitness that we like to share with people. It's this ongoing challenge. You will never be, while you still have, juice left in you, life to perform, people to support, things you want to achieve, family to support, jobs to, bills to pay. Just like your physical fitness, you're always trying to improve it, but then gravity is trying to bring you back. And that's how life is with our mental fitness as well. And when it comes to mindset, this ability to work on yourself is really, really important. And so the three things that I like to say to people relate to when it comes to mindset is get in the monitoring habit, have what's called a growth mindset, and get in what's called the challenge mindset. So when people hear mindset, they often hear the word attitude, which is a term they heard in school. It might make them feel as like, that's my attitude, I can't change that. The first mindset that you need to be in is that things can improve. You can change. These things are a skill. And often when you hear the word mindset, you hear a lot of talk about positive thinking and positive emotions. They're not necessarily the same thing.
The Tony Robbins
and positive
Tony
thinking,
Robbins is fantastic. I've been to a lot of his events, And I loved it. But again, for some people, that's very American woo-woo. And even though a lot of it is science-based, and I love a lot of the Tony Robbins stuff, it is a bit much for some people. And the attitude of gratitude and the positive mindset and high five in the mirror, it got too much for some people.
I agree, and that's where we try and, a lot of the best science and ideas do come out of America, but you have to temper them for an Australian or a European or a UK or a Chinese audience, which is what we have. We have a global audience, and so we think this mental fitness is, because everyone pretty much is interested in physical fitness, or at least they should be. We think the same thing around mental fitness, and so positive thinking is saying that doesn't matter. Everything's going to work out for the best. In its most peculiar examples, you've got things like The Secret, where people say, well, if I just think about it hard enough, I'll get that Ferrari.
Yeah.
And it leads to, disappointment. It leads to dashed expectations. Manifestation, that's exactly right. And, positive thinking isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you are prone to too much negative thinking, you should probably do a bit more positive thinking. And there are ways to do that. But for most people, most healthy and adjusted people, realistic thinking, and we'll talk about optimism in a moment, realistic thinking is important there. While we're on the word positive, a lot of people criticize the word positive because it's not real, or it doesn't factor in the fact that you did lose your child, or your house did burn down, or whatever it might be. It's not all or nothing. And one of the things that we talk about a lot in mental fitness is thinking traps, and basically ways that we think incorrectly. We haven't actually talked a lot yet about our thinking skills, but that's one of the most
thinking
important,
traps. That's fantastic.
most challenging. Have you heard of thinking traps before?
No, I don't. I don't think I have. It's ringing a bell somewhere, but I'm not going to pretend to be able to articulate it. So let's assume I haven't.
So thinking traps are wonderful, and they've got different names, and I'll give you some examples in a moment. But once you understand them, the way you monitor your self-talk, the way you talk to yourself, and the way you hear other people, what they say, it changes everything. So a thinking trap is kind of like a belief or a use of language that traps you in negative thinking. So more than having more positive thinking in your life, you just need less overtly negative thinking. So what is an example of a thinking trap? So a thinking trap, probably one of the most common ones, is black or white thinking. Yeah, thinking as things as either or all or nothing thinking. For example, have you ever said to your wife, "You always do this. You never do that. You should do that." Always?
Catastrophizing.
Is that
talking in
catastrophizing? Is that actually true? Is that actually true? You always do it? And so, that's like 0 or 100. There's no shades of grey in between. That's one example of a thinking trap. Another one is the tyranny of shoulds. It should be like this. The world should be like this. I should get that.
Oh, yeah. You should all over yourself.
If you use the word should too often, it means you're fighting with reality. You're fighting with the way things are. And there are some things that should be different. There should be less homelessness. There should be fewer wars. But when it comes to your own life, and we're going to talk about the circle of control in a moment, you need to sort of bring down the things that should into the things you can control. Mind reading is another one. Who's ever had that experience where you're walking down the street, friends walking down the other side of the road, you wave to them, you say hello, they don't wave back. And you think to yourself, oh my God, They must hate me. When reality is, they probably just didn't hear you, didn't see you, and they're probably preoccupied with their own worries. And that's mind reading, where we put something into someone else's mind, and then we believe it. Well, they hate me, therefore I'm not going to call them. And then these thoughts lead to all sorts of behavioural consequences. If I think that the person ignored me at the water cooler, I'm not going to go and talk to them at the dinner party on Friday night because they probably don't like me. And then I'm going to miss out on all those benefits of connection, and you can see all the spiral that goes down. There's another one called emotional reasoning. I love this one. Emotional reasoning is just because I felt it means it's true. So I feel scared of this. Therefore, it is objectively true that that thing is scary. And one of the things that mental fitness teaches us is it's not what happens to us, it's how we think about it. And our feelings around things don't have to necessarily become reality. Thoughts are not facts. Feelings are not facts is one of my favourite quotes. The things we think and feel are just ephemeral things that pop into our mind that usually we latch onto. We usually latch onto them because they're pretty useful, but we don't filter the good stuff from the negative stuff or the useless stuff, and so everything tends to stick. And so they're thinking traps, and in our 2024 diary we have a whole chapter on thinking traps and how they impact how we talk to ourselves, how we get down on ourselves, how we close ourselves down to possibilities and to options. And then where it gets really tough for us is when we bring those things into language and conversation and we impact others, like our kids or our spouses, and we start to become people that aren't that pleasant to be around.
That is one of the hardest things, because especially
that's the
children,
first part of
children should be vulnerable. Because children are vulnerable in so many ways, but we're also very vulnerable. We're so vulnerable to influence from other people, and more so now than ever, we're so exposed to everything online. You have to stand guard at the corners of your mind. You have to stand guard at your ear. Like, I don't watch the news. I don't listen to the radio. I am probably overly cautious about the things I allow to go into my head, and that's why I control my life with podcasts and audiobooks, and I'm always trying to pour extra stuff on my side of the scales, because I know there are many things outside of my sphere of control that are going to penetrate my thoughts and my beliefs and my blueprint of the world. So, but I don't think as many of us, and I don't pretend to be better than anyone else, but I don't think as many of us are present and cognizant and conscious of the things that are going in.
Absolutely, and and we're going to talk about that in a moment when we get to mindfulness, and that's another word that has negative connotations that I would love to dispel for a lot of people. But if I can I just briefly touch on the other two aspects of mindset that I think people would find valuable?
Please do.
One is the term growth mindset. You might have heard the term growth mindset. They teach it in schools these days, and a growth mindset is basically how we respond to failure. So let's say something goes wrong or we fail. Does that failure reflect on you as a permanent state of who you are, or is it situational? So for example, I didn't get that job interview, or you went for a job as a captain of a firehouse, you didn't get it. Is it because you're simply not good enough, you're a terrible firefighter, you're a bad person, X, Y, Z? Or is it because you simply didn't prepare well enough for the interview? Could it be that there was a better candidate? Could it be that it's actually not the right thing for you in your career right now? Could it be that you could have answered a question differently, but next time you go for an interview, you'll learn and you do it differently? So is it situational or is it a permanent trait? And the growth mindset is distinct from a fixed mindset. And so the example that I like to use is when I was in school, I was really bad at maths, but I was really good at English. And all the Asian kids, for example, were amazing at maths. And I thought it was because they were Asian. They were just born that way. They were born good at maths. I was born bad at maths, and vice versa. I was good at English. And so what no one ever told me when I got my first E for maths was, you just haven't prepared well enough. You just haven't practiced hard enough. You just need to, find a new strategy. It's nothing to do with you and your innate abilities. You just haven't found the right way yet. And it's a wonderful way for teachers and for parents to talk to their kids without, labeling them and sort of putting them in these boxes. And the thing about mindset, the most wonderful little word, it's a 3-letter word, is the word yet. And so often we find ourselves saying to ourselves and to each other, I can't build that podcast the way I want yet. I can't get Tony Robbins on my show yet. I can't, run 3 businesses and be a firefighter yet. And so that word changes everything. It takes something that's permanent and final and makes it, okay, I just have to figure out how. And it's such a wonderful way of opening up our horizons. So that's the growth mindset. And there's a wonderful book called Mindset, if you like books, by a lady by the name of Carol Dweck. She's a US researcher. Yes. She does podcasts. There's all sorts of summaries online, and she talks about that one. And then the third part of mindset that I love is what's called the challenge mindset. And this comes from Stoicism. It's popular amongst cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's basically when life throws you a curveball or punches you in the face, you see it as a challenge, not a problem. Now, language matters. You're probably hearing us talk about language a lot here. A problem is something that's getting in the way of a desired outcome. A challenge is something that you will inevitably overcome with the right resourcefulness. Now, some challenges are bigger than others. And I'm not saying the problem is a challenge you just didn't want. Yeah, exactly. And that is about reframing. That is about the mindset of, well, let what happens be what I want to happen. And the Stoics, which is the ancient Stoics, which is very different to what we think about Stoicism these days. The ancient Stoics, well, I think it was Epictetus, said, let what happens happen, and I will be okay with it. And I've pretty much managed to distill this philosophy into my life. I still get surprised occasionally by setbacks. I still get disappointed by them. But when something happens in my life, I think, here is a chance for me to practice all this stuff that I write and speak about. Here's a chance for me to test my resilience. Life is testing me extra. And in fact, in my own case, over the last 2 or 3 months, life has tested me more simultaneously than it has at other times. And I haven't done it as well as I would have liked to. I've had family challenges, financial challenges, physical health challenges, whatever it might be.
That's one of the things I really was a privileged post-traumatic growth aspect from addiction, because something that's used commonly in Alcoholics Anonymous is the Serenity Prayer, which has many of its groundings within things like Stoicism and speaks a lot about what we're speaking about here, and also the sphere of control, which I know we're coming on to. It's that aspect that, and again, I'm not remotely religious, but it's giving yourself, or even asking from the universe, that serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And that is a constant road where you slip from left to right into the gutter of each, and trying to keep yourself on that path. It's not a level you complete and arrive at. It's something you've got to constantly do. It's like, it feels like you're constantly getting pulled into the river, and you've got to hit that reset button 50 times a day to stay in the middle of the road.
Absolutely. And the circle of control is one of the concepts that we love the most as part of mental fitness, and that we teach in our courses. And what it is some things are in your control, some things are not, and some things are in your influence. So if we go with the things that are outside of our control, that is most of the things on our minds. And in the modern world, so many things are uncontrollable. Now, what happens with the war in the Middle East, for most people, is out of their control. Doesn't mean you can't care about it and be concerned about it, but that is out of your control. The ultimate effect of climate change and whether the planet will, burn, you cannot control that. And so the ability to have that distinction between what you can control and what you can't can, for many people, just lessen the pressure or the power of that. What is in your influence is the things you do, the actions you take, the thoughts you have to contribute towards that end. So if you care about climate change, what are you doing around talking to others about it? Are you trying to change their minds? Are you contributing to certain causes? Are you voting a certain way? they're the things you can influence. You're focused more on the process than the outcome. And a lot of people who get frustrated and angry with themselves and with the world focus too much on outcome, on things they can't control, and not enough on the process of things that they either can control or can influence. One of the things that gets most people caught up is that they think they can control the people in their lives. And even if you're not a control freak, you think that just by saying something or convincing someone that you'll be able to get your kids or your partner or your employee or your boss or your friend or your neighbor to do things a certain way. So the other people in your life are in that influence category. 3 concentric circles: what's in my control, what's in my influence, and then heading out to what's out of my control. Most things are out of your control. Other people are in the influence category. You can say things a certain way, but you won't actually ultimately be in control of what they do or say. The things that are in your control, now we're learning from science that this is not always true, but it's effectively your thoughts, your feelings, your actions. We said before that it's not what happens to you that determines how you feel and think, it's what you make it, how you respond. Well, there are tools for doing that. But what you do, what you say, what you plan, those things are in your control. And what focusing on what you can control does for you is it leads you to feel less frustrated. Frustration, I think, is one of the most underrated, under-talked about emotions, particularly amongst blokes, probably amongst guys like firefighters, who so often in their lives are in control and are able to take action on a situation because that's what they're trained to do. But there are other situations where they're not in control. For example, Karen Ravitch and Martin Seligman in the US did a resilience study called Comprehensive Soldier Fitness. And basically, for the soldiers that are going away to the Iraq War, they said, hey, we understand this mental health, resilience stuff is important. Let's try and prepare soldiers psychologically for battle, to try and prevent PTSD. Sounds great in theory, doesn't it? Well, they did all this training, they sent them all away to war, and then a whole lot of them came back. They tested them while they were away, they tested them while they came back. And you know what a really surprising result was? The psychologists thought it was all the traumatic stuff, the brutal stuff, the killings, the bombs, all the ugly things you see in military and in your line of work. But it turns out that, with some exceptions, people handled that stuff pretty well because they were trained for it. They were more often in control of what was happening. The things that caused a lot of grief for people was what was happening back home while they were on deployment. They chat with their partner. The kids are playing up at school. They have almost zero influence or control over how that goes. Or, they might be worried that their partner's being unfaithful to them. What can you do from Iraq? And so it was these sort of soft, emotional issues back home that ultimately undermined people's resilience, not so much the traumatic stuff. And all that stuff still mattered, of course, but it was a surprise to the researchers. And, from my limited experience with emergency services, I find that to be the case as well. You don't just turn up at work a separate person to the person you are at home. And a lot of these workplace resilience programs that you see, expect you to drop your problems at the door at 8 o'clock, be productive and focused, and then leave and pick them up again at 6 and then go home. It's not how it works. And that's why so many of these programs, this is what we were talking about before the show, so many of these programs, are not well communicated by HR or by or senior leadership. People think, hey, if HR is telling me to do it, I don't want a bar of it. But it doesn't mean the concepts of resilience, of mental fitness, are not valuable in their own right.
Yeah. You've got to take the message, ignore the messenger sometimes. And that can be so very difficult for some people. There's one of the aspects in framework, and we referenced it a little bit earlier, around optimism, that I think is probably one of my favourites, maybe because it makes me feel like a child. And they do say, that optimists are more successful, but pessimists are right more often, which is a frustrating reality. And then there's those in the middle that you spoke about earlier being the realists. And many pessimists claim to be realists because, again, they tend to be more right than often, but I don't find they are happier individuals. I think life in general is more difficult for them, and they cling to that blueprint of being a realist as something that makes them feel informed, something that makes them feel like a professional. But I don't think that's a belief that helps them.
Absolutely. Especially, there's studies done in finance that, the market over time goes up, but there's always a great reason to be worried. And, pessimists, it's often a great way of sounding smart and authoritative to be pessimistic, because you can tell people all the ways that things are and can go wrong. It doesn't sound all that impressive or articulate to say things will be fine. It might be different to what you expect. There'll be difficult periods, but over time, things turn out okay. That's probably not the message people want to hear, because it's so simple. It doesn't have a lot of insight to it. Optimism gets a bad name because it's this Pollyanna, everything's going to be perfect. And so people throw out optimism, the baby with the bathwater. But there's a concept called realistic optimism, which is that halfway point between the pessimists that you referenced before, who are always right, and the optimists who, get more things done. You need that balance right. If you are a very, very effective pessimist, you're likely to be negative, and you're possibly not going to see possibility in many aspects of life. And what does that mean? If you're a pessimist, you might be right more often, but the idea that you can improve your sleep or your relationships or your business, there's always going to be a reason that comes up. Yeah, but this is why not. Or yeah, that's true. But deal with it when it comes.
Yeah, the pessimist is the fixed mindset, isn't it? This is the way it will always be.
Yeah. What we encourage in our corporate trainings is to say to people, if you want to, when you're brainstorming in a meeting, there's always the black hat thinker. Someone will say some half harebrained idea that's kind of a good idea, and then someone else will go, but this is why it won't work. And then what that does is it changes the whole mood of the table. Pre-mortem. It changes the whole mood of the table to, well, this is why it's not going to work. Let's look for all the faults. I do this with my team. The how is not that important yet, rather than deciding the end state you want to get to. And so one way to get around that is, if you want to say something critical about the proposal or the idea or whatever it is, we have a rule. You got to say something positive first. So it might be, I think we should, put our podcast on a new platform. And someone will go, yeah, but that's going to be expensive or difficult, or it's going to be change over. And the way you sort of overcome that in a team environment is, actually, I think that could be good for this and this reason. However, this might be a downside of it. And it gets people to think in both the positive and the negative, because we are, and I always get this metaphor wrong, we are Teflon for the positive and we are Velcro for the negative. Negative sticks to us because of our upbringing on the savannah. The people who focused on the positive, and the things were going to be okay. The things that the people who said, "Oh, it's going to be totally right. Everything's going to be fine." They got eaten, and their gene pool isn't with
the
us
optimist
anymore.
Died because the optimist said, "I'm sure it's not a jaguar in the bush," and you said, "No, it's definitely a jaguar in the bush." And the optimist went, "I'm sure it's not," and the optimist got eaten. The pessimists survived, didn't they?
Absolutely. And the person who thought it was a snake when it was actually a stick, that's our DNA today. But we've gone too far. There are less physical, social, actual threats in the world. Despite what many people think, there are actually fewer real threats in the world than there used to be. Most of our threats these days are social or psychological. And, we have this thing called the negativity bias, which is that Teflon and Velcro thing. And a researcher by the name of Barbara Fredrickson said you need 3 positive emotions to counteract 1 negative emotion. 3-to-1 ratio. And it's really important. It's not positive thinking where it's like a 10-to-0 ratio. where it's like all positive. We're not going to accept, that positive vibes only. That is toxic. If you can't be real and negative, or I had a hard day, or my wife hates me, and it's positive vibes only, that's not healthy. But most people go the other way, and it's too many negative emotions. And the key is that it's not a 3 to none ratio, it's a 3 to 1 ratio.
And that moment right there, folks, or shortly after, was when the internet gremlins attacked. We fell into some technological challenges and we had a bit more audio we could use, but wasn't quite where we wanted it to be. So we brought our conversation to a close there after reviewing the conversation, and Hadleigh's going to be coming back on. There are some aspects we didn't fully cover there. We'd love to go into a bit more depth, so you may very well see round 2 conversation with Hadleigh coming up soon. But once again, I hope you took something from that. There was loads of great book recommendations. Hadleigh really walked us nicely through so many of the mental fitness framework, well-being, just some great takeaways, some great reframing that we did there, or that Hadleigh did, really. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you took a lot from it. Once again, check the notes below. Resilience Agenda. Check out their diary for 2024. You can check out their podcast as well. Thanks for coming back. Hope you're feeling good. Hope you're feeling better. Hope you're feeling better now than you did 2 hours ago. And if you want more of that, be sure to hang around with the podcast. Be sure to rate us. Be sure to support us. Remember, you can only access 200 of the episodes on the platforms if you want to get inside the podcast, if you want to get access to all of our debriefs, all of our documents, all of our discount codes. And if you want to support us, it would make me very happy. It's £3 a month, less than a Starbucks or a beer, depending on what your preference is. So if you want to support the podcast, please do check out our Patreon page. And thanks again for coming back. We'll see you next time. The Firefighters podcast was created to recognize, acknowledge, inspire, and hopefully even motivate these incredible individuals who have chosen to be part of the first responder community. Our driving purpose is to create a legacy resource for the current and future generations of firefighters and first responders. We get some incredible feedback from listeners and guests, and as the podcast grows, our desire to create longevity and sustainability means that we are asking for the support of our listeners. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to get discounts to our merchandise, hoodies, clothing, coins, patches, tallies, and also access to all of the incredible documents that get shared with us from our podcast guests and sector leaders, then please head over to our Patreon page, and for just £3 a month, you can support the future of the podcast. Please finally hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on the platform you're listening, and wherever you're in the world, please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.